Assalamu alaikum. Today I'm going to debunk rationality rules and his argument against God using the omnipotence paradox. So what is the omnipotence paradox? Well, according to rationality rules...
This crushes the most popular definition of omnipotence.
Well, does it really? So what we're going to do is let him give his argument. What I'll then do is once he's given that, I'll begin to refute it.
As observed by the 12th century polymath Averroes, one can prove that the very concept of omnipotence is self-contradictory by asking the simple question, can an omnipotent being create a stone so heavy that it cannot lift it? If the answer is yes, then the being's power is limited because it cannot lift the stone. But if the answer is no, then the being's power is limited because it cannot create the stone. And hence, an omnipotent being cannot exist.
So it's probably interesting to note at this point that Averroes was a Islamic theologian. He wasn't an atheist superstar, which is interesting point number one. Never mind the guy that introduced the argument for a moment. Let's move to the argument itself. The question is, can God create a rock so big that he couldn't lift it? Now, the first part of the sentence, no problem with it at all. Can God create a rock that's so big? Yeah, of course he can. If he's all powerful, as we're presupposing, then he can create a rock as big as he wants. The problem is with the last bit, that's so big that he couldn't lift it. The problem with this part is that it presupposes an anthropomorphic God. In order to talk about God lifting anything, you have to imagine him to be bodied, which means you have to imagine him to be a finite spatial being. Not only that, he has to be subject to gravity and on something like a planet or something, in order to be able to lift that thing above his head. This is ridiculous because this is not the definition of what God is. God is referred to as infinite, not as finite, as unique, as not like anything that's in creation. So you can't use words and terms that we associate with created finite beings, such as lift, and then try to apply that to an infinite being that is unique. Terms like lift can't apply to it, again, because they presuppose all these terms, Allah or God is the source of and isn't subject to, i.e. space, time, gravity, things like that. The second problem arises when you look at the terms and what is actually being asked in the question. So when you think of God as the infinite, as what he's defined as, and what is presupposed in this question in order for this question to make any sense at all, and if you then look at the stone as the finite thing or a finite thing, this whole question becomes quite problematic, because what it is actually asking in that case is, can the infinite create something finite that is so infinite that it's more infinite than the infinite, which is technically what is being asked. Can God create a rock that itself could overcome God? Can an infinite thing create another thing that we're still referring to as a finite thing, which is what a rock is, but make this finite thing simultaneously be infinite, which is a contradiction in terms, and I'll make note to what Rationality Rules mentions earlier on in this very same video, which helps make my point clearer. So highlighting again the problem with the question itself, it's asking strange things. It presupposes contradictions within its logic in order to then establish a contradiction in its answers. And then it uses the contradiction in its answers to go, haha, God doesn't exist, look at that. But the only reason the contradiction in the answers existed in the first place was because of the prior contradictions in the internal logic of the question. You can't use this as definitive proof of debunking of the idea of an omnipotent being. Third problem is, if God is infinite, and let's grant that you can make a finite thing infinite, or make another infinite thing, despite the problems being highlighted in the second point that I've just made, we'll ignore that for a moment and we'll say, okay, let's say that isn't an issue and we'll allow it. Can God create a rock that's so big that it overcomes God? In other words, can God create another infinite thing that's more infinite than him? Why is this an issue? If you've allowed the first contradiction and you ignore it, there's another contradiction that arises straight away. Can there be two infinites? Now, mathematicians, they would argue yes, there can. They use things such as, oh, well, if you've got a never-ending set of numbers from 0 onwards, that number is infinite. It goes on forever. And then you can have another infinite set, which is every number going from 0 onwards forever without an end, but also every number going back from 0 onwards forever without an end. That this technically would have to be double the size of the first number. And so you have two infinites, the one infinite being larger than the other. Now, the problem with this is that this is not something you would refer to as infinite. And if you want to refer to this as infinite, It's not the same use of the word as you are using when you're talking of the creator of all things, or of an infinite source, the being, God, Allah. These are two different ways of using the word. First of all, why? Well, in the mathematics term, there's always a start point. So there's a beginning. You set limits. First of all, we're only talking numbers here. We're not talking about consciousness. We're not talking about light. We're not talking about gravity, earth, things like that. We're not talking about anything other than this abstract idea of numbers which have a starting point, and then you say then they don't have an end. This is a limited idea. You've put limits on it straight away. You're saying, well, first of all, we're going forward in steps of 1. So every time we add a number, it's +1, +1, +1. That's a limit. You can change the limit, but you're still limiting it. So what you're talking about isn't the infinite. So say you have infinite A and infinite B, and you're saying that these two infinites are distinct things. God and the rock. They have to be distinct, because otherwise the question wouldn't make sense, because it needs to understand this as two things, two separate things, one overpowering the other. Now, are they infinite? Well, if infinite A does not include infinite B, then it is limited because it doesn't include that. And the same could be said the other way around. If infinite B does not include infinite A, then there is a limit on both of them, and therefore neither of them are God. It's not talking about anything infinite at all. It's not talking about an omnipotent being here. It's talking about a finite thing that happens to be able to create. And he says all of this in the same video that he mentions the law of non-contradiction. A thing cannot be A and not A simultaneously. If something is infinite, it's by definition not finite. If something is finite, it's by definition not infinite. You might as well be asking God to create something dry that's the wettest thing ever. Which one do you want? Do you want something dry, or do you want something wet? Do you want something finite or infinite? Black or white? You can't ask for two opposing things simultaneously. And if you ask for two opposing things simultaneously, and then you realise that the answer becomes problematic, it's not because you're being clever, you're asking a silly question. So to conclude, there's 3 problems here. The first one is the anthropomorphizing the idea of God. So the fact that this question itself requires that you imagine God as a finite-bodied thing in order for the question to make sense. That is itself a contradiction. If we've already established, specifically from like a Judaic and a Islamic perspective, that God is an infinite being, that he doesn't have a body, he's not a man. This question, it doesn't make sense. Not to mention the fact that it requires you to say God is limited because he can't limit himself. It's a silly statement to make. It doesn't make any sense. The second contradiction is that you're asking here whether or not God can make a finite thing infinite. You're asking for, again, another contradiction. You're asking for God to make something A into not A while simultaneously still being A, which is, again, a contradiction. A thing cannot be A and not A at the same time. Last of all, it also requires for you to imagine that there's a possibility of there being two infinites. Because if God's infinite, if this rock is supposed to be able to overpower God, it needs to be greater than the infinite, which again is a contradiction. The infinite, you can't get anything bigger than it. It's that which has no limits. And if you're saying that can something be bigger than the infinite, that again requires you to imagine that there's a limit around that infinite, and in which case it ceases to be the infinite, and so it ceases to be God. There's 3 contradictions here. You're asking in each sense that A be simultaneously A and not A at the same time, and as I'll show you now, rationality rules us and think that this is possible, or that we should allow this, that the law of non-contradiction is a genuine law we should be abiding by. So the fact that he mentions this at the beginning of the video and then goes on to just completely neglect that with his very first refutation of the idea of a God when he's attacking omnipotence just shows his inconsistency. So let's have a look at what he says about the law of non-contradiction, and we'll wrap up there.
If Russell was to assert that between Earth and Mars there is a microscopic teapot orbiting the Sun, then, in this case, it might well be impossible, or as good as impossible, to prove the negative. But if Russell was to also assert that the teapot is both entirely made of china and entirely made of steel, then we can prove the negative, because this concept violates the law of non-contradiction, which states that contradictory statements cannot both be true in the same sense and at the same time. Nothing can be made entirely of china and simultaneously entirely of steel. This isn't possible, and hence, by proving the negative, we can prove the non-existence of such a teapot.
Okay, well, if this is the case, then you can't ask God to be limited, because if you are, then you're asking him to be exactly what he isn't, while simultaneously still asking him to be God. It's like, oh, well, you're not strong because you can't be weak. So no, you can't refer to this as a crushing defeat of omnipotence or of God, or the concept or the idea or the reality of it, because it doesn't even understand the concept in the first place. It's riddled with presuppositions and suggestions which clearly point out that you're not talking about God.